to separate, you got things carrying over, solids carrying over. 10 state standards didn't work. We knew that. Somehow or another, government and everything, the standards never could do anything about it. So what we had in that period of time was a situation where it was a more political situation that was stepped into the board as far as decision. So I just want to begin to point out, and that's, by saying the 10 state standards was what we were forced to use. It didn't work, but somehow that's the way it was. But it's a lead into what maybe I'm reading on to Mālama and everything. But anyway, bear with me. Now, the next exposure I had, and because when I came out with a BS, and one of the first things I got recruited to work on the tsunami research program. Oh. Okay. 1946, April Fool's Day, we had a tsunami. It was devastating. And I was around then, and I could see what was happening. But it was in Lahaina, but not on the Big Island. People was, something really bad. But anyway, what it amounted to there then, but at the same time, there was a problem, and this is getting to more of the sewage treatment in the city governments. With more and more of the issues of pollution control and so on, there was attention to the industries in town, Dole pineapple candy. Dole City, we had Primo Brewery community. Oh. Kiwalo, we had the tuna cannery packers. Okay, so there was some concern about, the handwriting on the wall for this industry about having to deal with wastewater treatment somehow or another. Well, about that time, Dole Pine, well, basically to make a long story short there, I ended up recruited to go to Washington University. And part of the recruitment, I guess, so the reason was Dole Pineapple, somehow another contractor got Nathan Burbank or the professors at Washington University. Washington University was then focusing a lot on what we call industrial waste treatment and management. And at that time, along with that, there was, I remember when I spent my time there, there was a lot of effort on ozonation as one of the focus. Well, pineapple cannery waste treatment became my master's thesis, as an example. Huh. Now, and what I basically ended up doing from St. Louis, Missouri, Washington University, I had to fly back to Honolulu, Dole Canyon, sample for a week, get about 120 gallons of samples, 24 hours, hour-day samples and so on, at a port, for example. Freeze dry it, hand carry that, whatever was that, back to St. Louis, and to reconstitute it to begin my bench scale, particular bench scale activated sludge treatment. Oh. So that was how we started out. Now, in terms of that, as far as how to deal with it, and then there were a lot of recommendations as to how to deal with it. The place that was really heavy into it was San Jose, and they had all bulking sludge and all the city had very difficult time handling the food candy. So there was already no problem. And we're just trying to find an answer for city county or Dole Canyon as well. So anyway, that opened our eyes a lot, my eyes, and it's the first time I began to deal with treatment, the treatment technology. And then it turns out that it's simply a disaster trying to go with aerobic treatment, not so much disaster. What we ended up with on a bench scale continuous flow system, we ended up, no matter what, with fungus and yeast in the microbial population, no matter what. We are attempting to try to acclimate it to maybe something like a sewage treatment type of system, but it simply didn't work. The interesting part of it was going to get, the sewage sample to start off with from one of the communities outside of St. Louis. In St. Louis, they have a lot of industry and so on, so they actually started to have their problems also dealing with it. And that particular plant I was working with, and the operators told me, forget it, you're not going to be able to do anything with it. They dealt with their problems with what they call the Krauss process, is what I found out. The operators somehow they concocted a system where they used the supernatant from the digester, use digested starch to use it into aeration system, using the return spark and so on. And I found out that it was called the Krauss process. Well, anyway, here again, we were faced with locally a situation where we had to do locally, deal with our own problems. Relying on the maintenance side coming in just didn't work. It's like our 10-6 times. Anyway, that began to set the tone of what is it that we faced with locally. How do we go about doing it? Who do we get and so on. Anyway, that's how it started out in the 60s, even before. By the time the city and county ran into problems, in the environment, as far as the Federal Water Pollution Control Administration, Department of Health, Chapter 37A, again, just wasn't help, any help at all. What happened was the city and county at that time commissioned the water quality program for a while. The main consultant there was Herman Pearson out of Cal Berkeley. Chairman of the advisory committee was John Parkhurst. Now, John Parkhurst at that time was chief engineer and manager of the Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts. They, at that time, in the early 60s, started to pick up and run with their own programs. And about that time, they were already starting with planning, design, and going to construction with the Whittier Narrows treatment plant. It's a set process for basically groundwater recharge and reclamation of Whittier Narrows. They had a 10 MGD plant at that time. So they were already organizing to move on that basis. And the sanitation district made up of 70-something municipalities and so on. At that time, they started early. And each one of the municipalities could not do anything worth economically viable. What they began to do was begin to get together, collaborate, and cooperate and collaborate, what we might call. And then same thing with Water Factory, the Orange County side. And I asked them, on what basis did you get together? At that time, they had about 40 organization municipalities. They basically got together and agreed, and it was more or less like what I say, a contract operation, contract obligation. And my question is, how come you didn't go and get a statute or law to bind it? You see, that's too much humbug. You get into rights and they get hung up with all kinds of things. So actually, the whole idea of basically voluntarily and everybody on the basis of reason alone to come together, collaborate, and solve these problems together. Now, that's a very important point I'm making right here. And this is what will essentially lead into what we call Mālama. And let me go on and say a little more about it. But I think that this is one of the critical points as far as how we went about doing it. Now, Water Quality Program overall, there were consortium of 3 firms. Engineering Science was one, California. Sunmo Town Howard at that time was, was really just starting, basically that was Sunmo Town Howard locally. And what was called the environmental, Gillingham Environmental. They were an old construction company, but they created, I think, an environmental company at that time. The resident staff, so to speak, I represent the local Sunmo Town Howard. There's Andrew Kemmerer from Engineering Science and Carl Bacon from case at a UH, that represented the Gillingham Corporation. So basically, that's how the resident staff, and on top of that, we had all the different organizations and different entities. And there was a so-called Blue Ribbon Committee, dealing with that. But the point about it too was, and this is another point that I think is very critical. John Parker is the chief engineer. He was advocating, and at that time, I know you guys are consulting engineers, I was too, and so on, but people are consultants. The sanitation districts as an organization, they did almost everything in-house. Oh. They did not, or very little outside coming in. They did everything from within. And they pulled the whole organization together. And the core was what they call the professional engineer. One thing I noticed about the sanitation districts, to this day, and from back then, John Parker is the manager and chief engineer. To this day, the person that just retired was still called chief engineer. So they prided that they have a core engineering, professional engineering. Why was that? And the point they were advocating was, number one, their whole existence was for the community, public first, public health, welfare, safety, etc., first and foremost. Now, when I started out, I started Sunmore Town and Hall in '59 in the service youth. When I graduated, came out '62. Worked for Sunmore Town and Hall as an engineer. Franklin's son, the first day I showed up in the office, a few mistakes and all that. In the office, the first thing he told me, one, Sunmore Town and Hall is a professional engineering company, not a business. We are not a business. We are professional engineering. And this is not a job. This is a career. Okay, I make a point that is very, very, very critical. So that was the difference. And now, in terms of the company, service before profit. You can remember that. And since then, I've been with the Sunmore Town and Hall, became Emily Pacific. We were bought out 5, 6 different times, and each time we became business as time went on. Anyway, this was a very critical point as far as what is the core and the foundation. Okay, I just wanted to point that out. Now, this is how we started out, and this is the water quality program for water. Basically, and then what was decided at that point, the critical part. The fundamental, I think, the strategy in simple terms, I would say. And I'll just bring out Gary Commoner's way of putting it as far as what ecology was all about. In simple terms. Law number 1, everything is interconnected to everything else. Number 2, everything has to go somewhere. Law 3, nature knows best. Law 4, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Okay, so that's how, as far as the strategy goes, we said, and the focus at that time was what are we going to do with all the sewage treatment discharges and so on, but that was the emphasis. There was more from the environment. But everything has to go somewhere. Put it where it does the least harm to the environment or where it will do some good, as in reclamation. That was simple, the way we looked at the whole thing. At that time, we had about something like 40 different, discharges, all discharging to streams and so on. So basically, we ended up, regionalizing and so on, combining. And the major part used to be the Santa and Honolulu, the Mālama Bay. And the whole notion, that was the biggest. As far as the reclamation part of it, that was one of the first things that we looked at. Because one of the models that we're looking at was also, Israel, how they started out. And the other model was about the sanitation district. And the other one was Irvine Ranch, which is a combination of water and wastewater management, one department entity. So what it amounted to, if you look at Oahu, the total water, hydrologic water front, it's about 170 FGD in terms of rainfall and so on. About 300 is surface runoff and evapotranspiration. 1,000 million gallons per day equivalent in round numbers went into recharge the groundwater. Out of that, sugar industry was taking about 280 million gallons per day for irrigation. Board water supply was taking maybe about 100. All sewage point discharge were maybe about 70 million. These are numbers I'm just throwing out, but just a ballpark number. What it amounted to was, if we take all the sewage effluent, we can turn it into irrigation water. They use irrigation water is about 280 million gallons per day. There's about 80 or so in round numbers, point discharges, sewage effluent discharge. If we can convert that to irrigation, we can solve that problem. Israel at that time was reclaiming almost everything they could. And they started out creating Nation of Israel about 1948. And about that time, as I recall, and I'm saying this because one of the things that when I was at camp, I shared an office with a visiting professor of Technion Israel Institute. Oh. So, basically I had some personal, just about talking stories and a lot of information of them. And actually in 2012, I did go to Israel, for several reasons, to visit there as well as to the Cal Alumni Association. But anyway, what it amounted to was reclamation for irrigation. There was an opportunity, but it wasn't that simple, not a one-to-one. One thing about reclamation, like anywhere else, they can use it when they need the water, but it's not 100% perfect. So they got time, I think Irvine Ranch at that time, they built microsync plant about 15 MGD. But on an annual basis, they use way less because in the winter months, they say they don't irrigate, a lot of the irrigation. Israel, they need, they're in the desert, they need the water, but they need the water 3 months out of the year the most. Maybe. Their problem is storage. They gotta store that. And what they have been doing from the 60s was actually the groundwater injection and pump out. There were injection wells as well as same wells essentially they use now. So basically during the year, nationally they state about 80%. If they could squeeze out the water from their solids, they'll be reclaiming up to 90%. And they're using so much water, they need so much water and reclaiming so much that they're just about capturing every drop of water. So the Jordan River is almost dry. The Dead Sea on the Judean side is losing water, the water level keeps dropping. So they don't have the runoff replenishment. That they went to that extent in trying to, it's what they call one water, basically they're capturing as much of it. And so much so that they even have to go to the ocean side, the Mediterranean for, seawater desalination for drinking water. So anyway, as far as we are concerned, The problem is in almost everywhere. You need to have, and this is what, Ern Pearson said, you need to have the backbone, so to speak, to take care of when you don't need irrigation, but the rest you need to do. But otherwise, in our Pacific situation, we have two, what they call, I'm not an oceanographer, I will use the term a two-layer ocean. The bottom layer, which is, basically in the colder bottom layer in the Pacific, you stay stratified, stably. The thermocline is such a very stable. And the numbers as far as the residence time, turnover rate, the residence time of that layer is something on the order of 5,000 years, maybe longer. So the idea was inject as much as possible, discharge it into that bottom layer, and try to reach, can never come up. But it turns out in that period of time, we were looking at how deep can we go. Now, at that point in time, it was still, 69 and early 70s. We're looking at the Hyperion, as the outfall that was constructed as the model of the limits. And it was about 200 feet was about the limit. And what did they base that on? And from our discussion, with the Los Angeles people, it was trying to get the constructability, especially the inspectors as well as the person directing it down in there. Now, at 200 feet, the bottom time, basically you can't leave somebody down there along, scuba diving or even harbor diving. So they solved their problem, which is kind of ingenious, was a pipe, horseshoe pipe. They straddled the pipe, and the director, as far as the contractor, is one side, the inspector on the other watching. So they can spend the time, looking at and then directing construction effort. So anyway, this was the limit as far as, but since then, with the development of, with the new technology, with polyethylene pipes and so on, you can go almost indefinite how deep you can go. So while we go 240 feet is where they are now, they stop there, we can go even further. And it's better to do that if we're really afraid of the consequences as far as water quality and so on. It would be more cost effective to try to extend the outfall into deeper waters, as deep as you can possibly go through on a practical basis. Now, I think that was the whole idea at that time. Now, what was also a consideration, about that time there was this John Craven, who was what at that time the Marine Affairs Coordinator for the state. His argument and advocacy is we're in the middle of the Pacific, surrounded by the Pacific Ocean. Not only in stratified, the water down there is about 40 degrees, Fahrenheit. It's something like a refrigerator temperature. Ecological metabolism is very low and so on, whereas, But what he's suggesting is that at that depth, we don't have the sunlight. We don't have the photosynthesis. So we have these spans of oceans, on a global basis, about 70% ocean. But the biomass of life, terrestrial versus, the oceans, all the oceans support only about 1% of the biomass in the whole globe. But really, we don't have a limitation on the plant life in the deep ocean region. So it's a very different kind of situation. We don't have on the terrestrial, the biomass of life is plants. And from there, of course, in a higher trophic level, the animals that produce the consumer goods. So what John Craven is suggesting is that instead of trying to worry about protecting water quality, were we doing a benefit to the ocean ecology? That was his argument. Now, that created a lot of controversy, of course, in front of the environmental agency. Although in that period of time, there was enough interest in that Region 9, administrator then was Paul DeFranco. And he was following the water quality program in that period of time. So he knew what was, what City County was proposing to do, and what he proposed to do under that program. So he was suggesting also that we can and we should build on that and use that as a basis to be safe. This whole idea of it. So instead of just a disposal, where we might do, there might be some benefit, something we can do beneficially to waste disposal. So that idea was something that, at least attracted their attention enough so that there was some, proposal even to try to give up and plan to do something about it. But anyway, that was the whole, development and the experience that was going on. In the meantime, with statehood, there was a movement more from the political side of things. Jack Burns was governor and so on. Looking at the future as far as, okay, we are territory, we're taking our cue from the mainland, we're listening to Washington, D.C. When we become a statehood, which we did in 59, this was a time then that we would have an opportunity to be masters of our own destiny. If that's the case, then what do we do about it? How do we plan? Okay, there were of course people saying, boy, that would open up opportunity for us from the economy side, which happened, a lot of productive population growth and then construction, economic development. But at the same time, there were people like, and one of which was Kenneth Brown, and there were others like him. They're saying, wait a minute, we don't really have a problem like the mainland do. We have a problem with it's opening up, you're going to pave over everything there with construction, all kinds of treatment plants that's springing up and we're doing. He said, okay, basically that was his point. Growth management was his whole, idea. So there are several others that were also suggesting we do that. One of the things he was suggesting also that with the growth management, there is such a thing as the carrying capacity of the place. How do you determine that? How do we get about, trying to set limits, and how do you implement such a thing? And by that time, with the water quality program, this is where I got kind of, let's say, sucked into the whole movement. Yeah. When I first met Kenneth Brown, he was state senator, and he was, of course, and going in outreach with the water quality program, he was also one of those that were part of the discussion and so on. So this is how it began to come up. Now, about that time also in the early 70s, Kenneth Brown was also, along with, again, some of the others, he was also one of the senior authors in drafting the environmental plan that was being proposed at that time, which was really along the lines of growth management. And along with this now, in that same period of time that, the water quality management program, the water quality program in 1969, what was going on in Congress? I just want to point out something on the record. Congress came up with a white paper in 1968 on trying to come up with a national policy on that time. There'd never been a lot of federal involvement with the national, the environment, but there had been no consistent national policy. And here there was an effort to do that. in the Congress. And of course, when it comes to the environment, it's just about you neither here nor there. It's such a big, broad situation that they were all over the map. But about the proposals that were being contemplated in Congress. Now, you must think the first statute was the 1899 Refuse Act. That was in 1900.
I remember.
And I point out that 1899 Refuse Act because that's where the NPDES permit program started out. It's the damn permit that, NPDES ended up with a bureaucracy of a life of its own, that carried over a good part of the century. It wasn't until 1946 or so, in the 40s, that, began to take shape, the Clean Water Act, and parts of it began taking shape in there. Now, one of the things that the Congress Public Works Committee came up with in 1946 made an assessment of what was the problem with the nation trying to can't get their act together in controlling pollution. The conclusion is very telling also. And they said, first of all, it was neglect. Second, ignorance. Third, public indifference. And I remember that, I'm quoting it, you guys can look it up. And there is a document out, which is a congressional document, the legislative history of Public Law 92-500. It's an over 1,000-page document that spells out a lot. And in there you'll find all kinds of things. There are also other documents which is related to NEPA, and that's very important. And I just pointed out a white paper also. But what it amounted to was here there are people like Kenny Brown advocating what needed to be done as far as us locally, how we should go about organizing and putting things together to implement our own environmental program. And this was all being done before the federal laws came into enactment. So there are a lot of things that already started out. And then we came to a point where we got to start reshuffle things to get to deal with the bureaucracy of it. But just want to point out that already Kenny Brown was, advocating these things. Now, I also mentioned in 1960, the changes in the paradigms of science. And this, I think, is very important also, that played a part in where we are and how Mālama idea concept came to be. About, well, this was more a century ago with the change, well, let's put it this way. In the 60s, there was the confirmation of the Big Bang theory, creation of the universe. Just put it that way. The other part, I would say, would be the development of a double helix, double helix proposal for the DNA, and the animal tectonic plate theory of the Earth. What does that all mean? And what does it mean to us in the environment? Okay, this is how I learned it. And I took my lungs going through, the academic side of things, and almost flunked out, because of it. Given quantum mechanics and Einstein's relativity, two basic, foundation of almost our sciences. And on top of that, of course, we come the life sciences. But let's take a look at it then. Quantum mechanics, relativity. I was given, almost flunked out of it over, actually Schrodinger's wave equation. Actually, I sat in class for, 2 weeks and I was going to drop the course and I was going to drop out. But the takeaway for them, that horrendous equation and then Einstein, the takeaway from that, nothing in nature is absolute. Everything is context relational. That's very important. Because everybody advocating this is the truth and so on. Nothing is absolute. That's the science of it. Now, what does that mean as far as what is important? So it turns out that in the quantum mechanics and the whole issue that brought it all on, the difference started out with is like a particle or a wave. Then you went through the whole bit and so on. It turns out that it can be both. And a particle, a boson, you can have two particles on top of each other, occupying the same space. Or you may have a particle, fermions, which are excluded. You can have only one in one space. And then when you have nothing in a space, no matter, nothing will not be nothing. You can have matter and antimatter. Combine it together, you get nothing, presumably. But you can separate matter and antimatter in this thing called entanglement. And you can separate whatever distance, whatever you do here, it will happen there in the opposite way, etc. Anyway, so this is how the whole thing came out. So what do you do about it? Now, I think along with the I was actually in dealing with the wave equation. I was given two publications to do. It's a wave equation. Schrodinger's Science and Humanism. The other one, Schrodinger's What is Life? I said, what? How is that going to tell me how to solve this damn equation? He said, what is the equation saying? In so many words, it turns out that really what really matters to us most of the time is that nothing is absolute. Okay, fine. What is relevant? Okay, science and humanism. So that becomes the human aspect of it. And by that time, in Cal Berkeley too, what is environmental engineering? Because was sanitary engineering called environmental engineering. Very simply put, Percy McGahey at that time, Professor McGahey was saying, environment is air, water, land, people. People? Yep, air, water, land. Well, anyway, and on and on. So what it amounts to is that as far as Schrödinger is concerned, science and humanism, that's what he's talking about, humanism. And his definition at that time of what is life started to refer to an interchange with entropy, positive and negative, as far as the person, that is like an change in entropy with the environment. Basically, it's a unity with the environment is what it amounts to. So the whole idea of the community is tying in with the environment, the unity with the environment. In Hawaiian, basically what it amounts to from day one is papa'o it's a unity. So what basically the quantum mechanics and physicists were advocating a century ago, what is life? Science and humanity. The equation of Schrödinger's wave equation, where I should point out, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle was proof of indeterminacy. What does it all that mean? That's how we look at it. It's the people's interpretation of how we view it. So what it amounts to is that the definition of what we are includes humanism, you might say, or how basically we look at it. So what is important out of all this is that one factor in how we deal with the environment. So when we deal with the environment, we are dealing not only with the people or basically the science of it or the natural or whatever. So we have to begin to look at it in its totality, is what it amounts to, the unity of it. So the wholeness or the wholesomeness is that the way I would just put it, maybe I'm leading you to the wrong. But you cannot look at only one part of it. You have to look at the whole of it in order to find out how all the whole thing comes together. So anyway, what Kenny Brown was putting out here, and in his, he said, when we talk about the environment, when we talk about the way he started putting out is that Hawaii is a special place. Why is Hawaii a special place? Because of the land, people, and spirit. And he started to point to the idea of the spirit of things. And how did the idea of spirit come into play? How do you, now the ancient Greeks, it turns out that in the book by Schrödinger, at least some of the ancient Greeks defined the soul of a person is basically the sum total of all the attributes, the physical aspect of personality, the sum total of it in harmony is called the soul. How do you can talk about a person's, stature, color, skin, hair, smile, and so on. How do you refer to that person as a whole? What word or what factor do you use? So the, terms like spirit, you see the soul, these are things that refer to the totality of a person or a thing. So anyway, this is how I'm reading it. If you got any questions on this, I'm kind of beginning to ramble on.
I do have a question though.
Yeah.
About if the technology is available, isn't a more appropriate approach to extend, so I guess for Sand Island, extend the outfall deeper into lower levels of the ocean below the thermal climb?
Oh, yeah. I think
versus going to full secondary treatment.
It turns out that's the best of all views. Extend it out further. If we could, back then, we would have gone out as far as. What it amounted to is now, when Ariyoshi became governor, he basically started the NELA, Natural Energy Laboratory of Hawaii. And the whole purpose was trying to develop, having the state itself develop its own energy opportunities and so on. One of which was the tapping into the deep ocean regime using the thermal climbs and the temperature differential for air conditioning and power generation, OTEC and so on. But the whole idea was, one of the things was to put a pipe out there, which is a polyethylene pipe deep enough. And the Mackay engineers and those other people that developed a system by which to do that. And the whole idea then was to make sure there's at least a backup system. But by then, it was already established that there was a technology to do it. But this was, much, much later. Now we know that we can do it. And the cheaper, the most cost effective, and the best thing is to do that instead of going to secondary treatment. You know, definitely, because it's a nonsense thing. It does nothing. So anyway, that was the idea that, you know, here we have an opportunity to do that. So I think the use of technology like this, it's almost like this other thing I want to point out, I think I may just throw out for consideration or just give you some fun. In 1969, not only did we, Chittenden County started the water quality program, you know, that was maybe, you might say locally some milestone. Nationally, another milestone in 1969 July was the landing of the first man on the moon, Neil Armstrong and guys, you know, Aldrin and so on. There was another milestone. That's what I say, but I may be the only one. The passage of NEPA, National Environmental Policy. Finally, it came out to congressional action after a good part of a good century, you know, came up with at least NEPA that opened the way for the other, you know, legislation. What came after NEPA, you know, in 1960? 1970 clean air was, but 1970 was also the creation of EPA.
Oh.
Now, how did EPA come about as such? What was proposed, you know, by the administration at that time were several options, one of which was to combine not so much US EPA as its presently constituted, but to combine an organization of natural resources, so to speak. USGS and NOAA and all that, to combine it all together. And the reason I pointed out was that in 1977, it turns out, you know, again, there was an organization of government. And at that time, Hawaii was also considered how to organize the environmental program. Do we have a separate department or what? But Kenneth Brown was, I consider him to be the principal author of that. But the chairman of the organization commission was one called Myron Pinky Thompson, who was trustee of Community Schools. They were also looking at trying to organize and combine the organization, what nationally they were thinking. But looking at the documents then, especially with the Russell Train as his oral history, so to speak, he was the one that was advocating creating EPA the way it's presently. Created so that it began to organize. Everything is air, water, solid waste, and so on, you know, very separate individually. Congress, as a political entity, had a hard time trying to come to grips with a common, you know, total. Then left it up to the executive branch to put it all together through such a thing as an EPA. Hawaii was also looking at it that way, and these are, you know, people like Katie Brown and so on, to the environmental side. What, just discussion, talking story kind of thing. Part of the discussion came up, looking at water in its totality also, not only wastewater, water. So they can go on into the water side, into the farm. He was looking at something like the Ahupua mountain seals. Looking at the Ahupua as a living system, like a living organism, so to speak, a living system. Water was the blood of the entity called the Ahupua. Self-providing life-supporting system itself, but in there after connecting all the different parts of the system. And the water quality itself tells you, gives an indication of the health of all the system. As you go to the doctor, they take blood tests from you and so they can tell you that something's going haywire and so on. And blood is something they need itself, but also a carrier of mechanism. So here, this is the kind of philosophy of thinking. And there is, what is the totality of the Ahupua? One thing about Kenny Brown, if you read some of the writings, as far as he's talking about the natural environment and the constructed environment. There are two things. There's an ecosystem, and he said, don't forget the ecosystem has humans in there. Ecosystem with humans. Okay, when we look at it in the first, after getting over chapter 37, and we're going with the ecosystem approach to the water quality standards, for example. But there was more that should have was intended to come to include the human aspects of it. So here we have this whole idea of the human aspects of the natural system and how do you deal with it. Now, if you look at the totality of the federal law, you have the Clean Water Act, and basically you have the emission, but you have the Safe Drinking Water Act, which followed right afterwards. Now, it's not quite in the same way analytically. What we have, we're dealing with risks more than the actual, the causative factor. We have the acceptable risk as part of the idea of the regulation management, whereas we're looking at specific in the clean water side. So you have a different way of looking at it, combining the whole of the water, the whole idea of one water that you hear things about. What's, the two dish right? But in the case of Kenny Brown, it was more than just one water, it was one health. To have a healthy person, you must have a healthy environment, a healthy community. Now, when I met Kenny Brown, let me jump ahead 1 minute. It was 1969, I just barely knew him. And I knew Kenny Brown, worked with him from about 40. When he came into about 1990, he asked me, he was chairman of the board of the Clean Health System. He asked me to join the health system board. And then also the Clean Air Foundation board. Now, what basically he was trying to achieve there too, and eventually what it turns out that he asked me to come in, not as a consultant or board member, was to go over and join the Clean Health Systems board as vice president, as part of the organization itself. One of the things that the system was, and this has to do with the Mālama aspect of it. Queens Medical Center was trying to upgrade a lot of facilities, I guess, in there. And they were doing it for over a decade and couldn't do it for one reason or another. The thing about it was being a board member, they were hiring nationally known reputable architectural firms in India. But somehow or another, they couldn't move the projects. It wasn't the lack of. What basically ended up doing, this is again, this is my way of emphasizing it, is what I'm saying that in all the years, looking at the context and the duration aspect, what did that without mean? What was it? And I see this, well, I better not say it, but what I think has happened here, and it was actually, I think, for him, or even the Queens, it was a gamble, I would say. I think it was a gamble. But what needed to happen, definitely, absolutely, it had to be an inside-out approach. Plans were developed. We spent something like $12 million developing all different plans and all different kind of proposals and so on. Nothing happened. Somehow or another, the organization did not react. They were, in fact, opposed what was happening. So the idea was start inside out. So I was given the title of vice president, authority to do it, and so on. What did I do? I basically knew nothing about, first time I worked for a medical center. One of the first things was to upgrade the OR, the operating room. I'm not a surgeon. I have a PhD. They call me doctor. They thought I was a medical doctor, but somehow or another, they found out that, wait a minute.
You're a doctor of the environment.
Yeah. But it turns out that it made a whole lot of sense that we started inside. What I did, first of all, was ask for volunteers. This is what we're going to do. We got to upgrade all these things, we're doing certain things, and I help, people to advise me. Surprisingly, a lot of nurses, doctors, and so on volunteered to come in. But that approach that I took over, basically I was appointed to the health department in 1975 back then with a tool. At that time, we're starting, I did the same thing. I asked for volunteers. Hey, we're going to start doing things differently. Why don't we try this? And Paul DeFranco was saying, as far as I have his support and cooperating, I flew to San Francisco, and even asked EPA people, do you have any volunteers to come and join me? Jackie Palmer. We had several people that volunteered to come over to work. I had people coming out from work and so on, but it worked. I did that same thing for Queens. But it worked. So it turns out that it was from within pulled together the organization and started to work together because, people have been doing, operation with doctors and so on. They know what needs to be done. So basically what it amounted to was trying to get the term core within the organization to pull it together. And then, with the support and the financing and so on. And of course, we had to pull in architects and architects as well as engineers from the outside for development plans and specifications and so on. But it was from within to support from within, as far as the plan and specifications and construction. And from there is going to within as far as the construction then, what we ended up doing was actually not so much going out to low bid, but we actually doing a proposal for what we call, the term we called it was design assist. We called the contractor to be part of the design team. And they basically turned out, a contractor made a lot of proposals, save cost and what can be done as construction. So that's basically how it was an inside out type approach. And as far as my mom always said this, and this is Kenny Barnes, my assessment of it, an inside out approach. It starts with the person. Each person starts with the person himself that believes that whatever has to be done is the way to go. Starts there and then work out. Now, I mentioned the white paper that Congress put together in '68. The thing about, I told him, the last sentence in the white paper that Congress put said the ultimate responsibility, and so on, for the maintaining control of the environment rests with each individual citizen. Starts with the individual. Just get one person, two people, and on, and work out inside out. Basically, this is what Kenny was suggesting for his proposal anyway. This is what I saw. He started there and working on it. And this is what I see as what happened. So that's part of the necessary part. Now, I pointed out putting man on the moon. Apollo 11 was a milestone. President John Kennedy started it. It's a top-down kind of thing. Right at the end of the decade, we're going to put a man on the moon and bring him home safely. It's important, the last part of it, bringing him home safely. Because not only that, they went after that, they went to Mars. They can get to somebody at Mars, but I don't think they can get anybody home safely yet. I can tell you. But as far as, even the NASA and then the Apollo program, putting a man on the moon, I think it was the organization itself and how they went about doing it is something that is the important part of it. How they went about doing it. Getting the people, well, for one thing, getting the nation behind saying, let's go with it. Putting a man on the moon. Why do that? And then say it's going to take $25 billion. In today's term, maybe it's about $200 billion. To get Congress, and where did they get the numbers from? Well, I think it's floating around. How did Congress appropriate that money? It's taxpayers' money to go ahead and put a man to it. How did they do that? Well, I think it's a long story doing that, but what it amounted to was, well, it started with John F. Kennedy. And one of his inauguration messages was, ask not what the country can do for you. What can you do for the country? So that's set the tone for things. By the end of the decade, we're going to put a man on the moon and bring him back home safely. What? So he created all kinds of things, but to make a long story short, Congress appropriated that $25 billion to put a man on it. The thing that is impressive about it to me, well, there were a lot of things, why are we doing it, all kinds of things in the country. But one of the things about that organization and effort came out in the papers and so on at the report. When a reporter was asking, there were about 300,000 people involved in trying to get the whole program together. And what was publicized at that time was that when they asked the janitor what his job was, and what was reported was the janitor said, I'm helping to put a man. The janitor said that. When you have everybody responding that way, there's something about that organization that's going to succeed. Everybody was on the same page. When the man stepped out, I was a child still going to school. That time, July 1960, I had a 13-inch black and white TV that, my family were target about watching that before. But it turns out the whole world was watching that time, just in awe. Man on the moon. And one of the impressive things about it that thing was coming was planting the flag, American flag, but not declaring it claiming for America, but for all of mankind. So already, it was beyond that. So I think the motivation, I just want to point out the motivation that went into putting it all together. Certainly science and technology started it. And there was a big push to get it started by one of James Webb and so on, getting the whole thing moving. But to round it up and to complete it took people, humans, humanism. And this is where I see Mālama comes in. There's a science and technology. Definitely is necessary. But you need Mālama to make it happen. Now, along with that, while there's so much focus on science and technology as the motivation for the country spending the money to do it, in the history of time for thousands of years, the Polynesians traversed the whole Pacific and migrated to Easter Island to Hawaii. Without the science and technology that they had. What did they have? Each other, nature's resources. Two things, very basic. It's a very basic thing in everything that we do, according to Mālama. Without it, science, technology, and money is not going to do it. Mm-hmm. It, to me, is essential. It's the way I look at it. I came to that conclusion long before. Who was the one that advocated them? King John. He's such a laid-back person, He doesn't like to write things either. 40 years or so, just talking story, that's about it. There were three books that he recommended I read, And there are a lot more that I never got around to, he just unloaded me on it. One book was, I don't even know the 500-Year Delta. The other was The Careless Society. I think I said that.
Yeah, I read that.
You read that. 500-Year Delta. One of the things he said, we plan for 10 years, 20 years and so on. But you got to look further ahead. You got to look at something even deeper than just, the bureaucracy of meeting the requirements of 10. And one of the things out of that, the takeaway, this is about a quick book, I don't know when to put this. The takeaway from that, if we have to prepare ourselves for the future, what do we prepare? Do we plan on or hope that government will look after us, that we would have the science and technology to look after us? What is the best bet for us? What do we do? The conclusion there, according to the book, the way he and I interpret, is our own ability, our own innate abilities and attributes. We can do a lot. The native Hawaiians, and which is what Hokulea turned out to be, about the same time that in the 70s, early 70s, we were doing the water coordination. They were already, Kenny Brown, Pinky Thompson, some of the boys in society, trying to get feeding. Over there was starting out to be a scientific endeavor to prove that no, it wasn't just by accident, by drift of planet. The Hawaiians actually planned and did it. Is what did I want? What did it take according to Kenny? No. Anyway, I just want to put it that way is my take on it. And I'm not saying that's the final gospel truth, just my way of, since I've been involved with it for the past half a century or so. So anyway, I can go on and on and on.
Well, Fred
That's
said,
enough, maybe I said enough.
Fred said that he likes your take on ethics with responsibility on the right thing to do for the island.
What?
Fred Lee he works at Veolia at Honolulu Wastewater Treatment Plant. He said that he likes your take on ethics with the responsibility on the right thing to do for the island.
I'm not.
Here, you can read it on the screen.
Oh, somebody wanted to interrupt. I'm sorry.
If anyone else has any questions for Jimmy, please feel free to chime in. Thank you, everyone, for staying tuned.
Is that no questions?
I guess no questions.
I think there was a lot of food for thought.
Oh.
And I know based on my own experiences, I guess I have to confess, Jimmy was my boss for a good number of years throughout my career. Not only in the workplace, but when I went back to school, my last time around, he was on my dissertation committee. He was also the meanest guy in the room when I did my oral defense. But regardless of that, I've been a believer from way back in time that if you want to accomplish something, it's kind of like it takes a village to raise a child concept. And when you want to try to do something within the treatment plant, one of the things that was done years ago at the Waianae facility was getting the city and county, actual folks who were doing the work, involved in the process of deciding how things were going to be done. Physical layout, philosophy on how to operate equipment, everything was set down and talked with them. I think it was probably the first time most of those folks had ever seen a process and instrumentation diagram. But we took those out to sit down to show them, at least figuratively, what was going to happen, and took to heart anything that they said from their experience with everything into consideration on how things would be modified. And I found that doing that with all of the different projects that I've been involved in works the best. And I've always had the philosophy that if you don't want to get chased off of a wastewater treatment plant site that you're doing the design work for, make sure you get folks included right from the very beginning, because you don't want somebody chasing you with a large wrench to get you off the property. So the bottom line is work with everybody. That means also working with the engineers. But I want to point out one thing. I am an engineer, but I also happen to be a certified wastewater treatment plant operator. And the understanding of what's happening within the treatment plant, especially any specific treatment plant, is far better known by the folks who are there as the operators than any of the engineers that are going to walk onto the property. Because it's much like I remember hearing when I was a child, if you want to learn something about somebody, you've got to walk in their shoes to have a better feel of what they're seeing. And that is also true in what we do in work. And I think it's really an important factor in living the idea of the Mālama Ethic, which I think that is going to be available to folks on the AWEA website, the actual presentation that Kenny Brown made to the Senate. So I can remember a number of years ago passing that on to family members and so on to try to get folks to kind of have a little better feel of the unity that's required in order to accomplish a goal, because you can't do it by yourself. I haven't met anybody who can really pull it off. There's a lot of folks who brag about it, but I don't know how many of those folks really actually accomplish it, because it's usually other folks that help get you there. But I think one of the things that we didn't maybe talk enough about is also the real differences on island versus continent. And as Jimmy kind of pointed out, that can get really deep and heavy on both sides of that versus subject. But it is important to understand that the environmental laws that were made for the continental US. And that means the lower 48 and Alaska. And even Alaska has things that are quite different than the lower continental 48. Nobody who is a state has similar circumstances to what we have on all of the land, air, water issues that we've got. We are in a totally different ballgame. We're in a different ballpark. None of them are there. I think the simplest way to remember is when you're looking at coastal areas of the continent, they have continental shelves. And kind of as what Jimmy had alluded to, we are a series of mountains piercing an open ocean, and thereby way different than everybody else in all respects. And talking to EPA, I know I've had some challenges over the years. Jimmy's had his. And to get some of these folks who have a continental mentality to understand what we're talking about when we talk about Hawaiʻi, Puerto Rico, or any other island, American Samoa, you name it, Guam, etc. We are different. But trying to get them to really understand and advocate what really should be done for those circumstances is difficult. Just one more adder on the secondary treatment thing for Sand Island. Actually, a number of us have taken a look at it, Jimmy, myself, and a couple of other folks that were part of the group. And the final answer was take it down to a greater depth than 600 feet. At that point, you get out of virtually any legal entanglement that theoretically is there relative to the issues of where water quality for the state waters is considered and so forth. But as was pointed out, once you get down to that depth of say 620 feet or 650 feet, you are in a nutrient desert, which is going to allow other things to happen. And there was a paper put together by James Honke, for the 25th year celebration of basically EPA and water quality. And that points out with some photographs of the differences between the original outfall and what it looked on the surface, as well as what it looked like down and by the outfall, as compared to the existing outfall that Sand Island discharges through today. And they are dramatically different. And I can remember passing that concept on to one of the folks at DOH a good number of years ago. And that individual was amazed at the difference. But I mean, to me, it's not that amazing. You just got to think about physically, where are you relative to what's going on in that ocean environment? And that's one of the things that I think we sometimes make a mistake. And that is if we don't have the knowledge, get the people who have the knowledge as part of your team so that you can really look at things better. And always remember that whoever's going to be the end user, if you want it to be truly successful, have them involved from the very beginning that you can get them involved, regardless of what your municipality may say. But I guess we're supposed to wind up here, so I'm just going to stop. There's other subjects ultimately that maybe we can get Jimmy back. I don't know.
Thank you both so much. Thank you, Jimmy and Vic.
Oh, you know, one real quick one I just thought about. It was something that was mentioned to me many years ago by actually a coworker when I was at M&E Pacific. And it had to do with what's referred to as the environmental thought. And it's basically just three simple statements. Environmental issues are emotional. Environmental decisions are political. And environmental solutions are technical. Remembering when we say technical, it's really in the context, don't forget the human element. But I mean, you stop and think about those three statements and tell me that they're wrong.
No.
Anyway, thank you folks very much. I think Jimmy did a stellar job. Having worked with him for a good number of years and having him be a, I can't say adversary when I was doing my work for my dissertation, but somebody that I could rely on to tell me where you needed to move somewhere different. But overall, it's always been a very enjoyable working relationship and friendship.
Well, thank you.